Most people imagine control as something obvious. They picture commands, threats, or forceful individuals who openly dominate others. But psychology reveals a far more subtle reality. The most effective forms of control rarely announce themselves. They begin quietly, almost invisibly, long before you realize your decisions are no longer entirely your own. They enter through repeated habits, emotional conditioning, social expectations, and the natural human desire to belong. By the time someone recognizes they are being influenced, many of their beliefs, routines, and choices have already been shaped by forces they never consciously examined. Human beings are social creatures. From the moment we are born, our survival depends on learning from others. Parents teach us what is acceptable. Schools reinforce conformity through rules and evaluation. Peers influence our identity through acceptance or rejection. And society constantly communicates what success, beauty, intelligence, and happiness should look like. None of these influences are inherently harmful. In fact, they are essential for development. The problem begins when learning turns into unquestioning obedience, when external expectations replace internal reflection, and when approval becomes more important than authenticity. One of the most fascinating discoveries in psychology is that the brain is designed to conserve energy. Rather than analyzing every situation independently, it often relies on mental shortcuts known as cognitive heuristics. These shortcuts help us make decisions quickly, but they also make us vulnerable to adopting beliefs simply because they are repeated often, supported by authority, or accepted by the majority. This explains why people can passionately defend opinions they never critically examined. They mistake familiarity for truth and popularity for accuracy. Think about how often people alter their behavior without realizing it. They laugh because everyone else is laughing. They pursue careers they never truly wanted because society labels them prestigious. They purchase products not because they need them, but because advertising convinces them that ownership equals success. They remain silent when they disagree because they fear social rejection more than they value honest expression. None of these choices require direct coercion. They happen because subtle influence gradually becomes internalized until it feels like personal desire. The need for belonging is one of the strongest psychological drives in human nature. Evolution rewarded cooperation because isolation once threatened survival. Even today, the fear of exclusion activates many of the same emotional systems associated with physical pain. This is why individuals often sacrifice their own judgment simply to avoid standing apart from the crowd. They confuse agreement with security and conformity with wisdom. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that meaningful progress has always required individuals willing to think independently despite social pressure. Control also grows through repetition. An idea heard once may be questioned. An idea repeated every day eventually feels self-evident. Whether through media, conversations, cultural traditions, or personal relationships, repeated messages slowly shape perception. Over time, they influence not only what people believe, but also what they believe is possible. Someone repeatedly told they are incapable may eventually stop trying altogether. Another, consistently encouraged to rely on external validation, may struggle to make independent decisions without reassurance. In both cases, the prison is not physical, it is psychological. Freedom, therefore, begins with awareness. The moment you pause and ask yourself why you believe something, why you desire something, or why you fear something, you interrupt unconscious conditioning. You create space between influence and decision. That space is where independent thought is born. It is where emotional intelligence begins to replace automatic reaction, where discipline overcomes impulse, and where self-awareness transforms passive acceptance into deliberate choice. The strongest minds are not those that reject every influence, because no human being exists completely independent of others. Rather, they are the minds that evaluate influence carefully. They learn from many perspectives without surrendering their judgment. They remain open to new ideas while refusing to abandon critical thinking. They recognize that true freedom is not the absence of influence, but the ability to choose consciously which influences deserve a place in their lives. That is where real psychological independence begins, and it is the foundation upon which every lasting form of personal power is built. From the moment you enter the world, one psychological need begins shaping your behavior more than you realize: the desire to be accepted. As children, approval is linked to survival. Parents reward obedience with affection, teachers reward compliance with praise, classmates reward similarity with belonging. Slowly, your brain learns an important lesson. Acceptance feels safe, while rejection feels dangerous. This learning is not inherently wrong. It helps us cooperate, build relationships, and function within society. However, the problem begins when the need for approval evolves into the need for permission. Instead of asking yourself, "Is this right for me?" you begin asking, "Will people approve of me?" That subtle shift marks the beginning of psychological dependence. Modern psychology recognizes that human beings possess a fundamental need for social belonging, yet belonging becomes unhealthy when it replaces identity. A person who constantly seeks validation gradually loses the ability to make decisions independently. They hesitate before expressing opinions, suppress their authentic personality to avoid criticism, and reshape their dreams according to what others find acceptable. Over time, they no longer recognize whether their goals truly belonged to them or were simply inherited from the expectations surrounding them. Their life becomes a performance rather than an authentic expression of who they are. This invisible chain is particularly dangerous because it rarely feels like imprisonment. It often disguises itself as kindness, responsibility, or humility. You tell yourself you're simply being considerate, avoiding conflict, or trying to make everyone happy. But beneath these seemingly noble intentions may lie an unconscious fear of rejection. The moment your emotional stability depends entirely on someone else's approval, you have unknowingly handed them influence over your choices. They no longer need to control you directly because your fear of disappointing them controls you automatically. Consider how often people abandon extraordinary opportunities simply because they worry about what family, friends, coworkers, or strangers might think. Talented artists stop creating because they fear criticism. Entrepreneurs postpone bold ideas because they fear failure in public. Students choose careers based on social prestige rather than genuine passion. Countless individuals spend decades building lives designed to impress others while quietly ignoring the voice within themselves. The tragedy is not merely lost success, it is the gradual disappearance of authenticity. Social comparison intensifies this struggle. In today's interconnected world, people constantly measure themselves against carefully curated versions of other people's lives. Every achievement, appearance, lifestyle, or relationship becomes another opportunity for comparison. When self-worth depends on external recognition, these comparisons become emotionally exhausting. No amount of praise ever feels sufficient because someone else always appears more accomplished, admired, or successful. Validation becomes an addiction rather than a source of encouragement. Like any addiction, its satisfaction is temporary, demanding increasingly greater doses to maintain the same emotional comfort. Psychologists distinguish between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation relies on rewards, recognition, and approval from outside sources. Intrinsic motivation emerges from personal meaning, curiosity, values, and purpose. Individuals driven primarily by intrinsic motivation demonstrate greater resilience, creativity, and long-term satisfaction because their actions remain connected to something deeper than public opinion. They are certainly capable of appreciating compliments, but they are not emotionally dependent upon them. Praise becomes pleasant rather than necessary. History repeatedly demonstrates that meaningful progress often begins with individuals willing to stand apart from conventional thinking. Great innovators, philosophers, scientists, and reformers frequently encountered criticism before receiving admiration. Had they relied exclusively on public approval, many of their greatest contributions would never have existed. They understood that growth sometimes requires temporary misunderstanding. Their confidence was built through commitment to principles rather than popularity. Breaking free from approval seeking does not mean becoming arrogant, dismissive, or indifferent toward others. Healthy relationships require empathy, respect, and cooperation. The difference lies in where your identity is anchored. Emotionally mature individuals listen to advice without surrendering their judgment. They welcome constructive criticism without allowing it to define their worth. They value relationships while recognizing that universal approval is neither realistic nor necessary. Real confidence is not the absence of criticism, nor is it the constant presence of applause. Real confidence is quietly continuing to act according to your values when applause disappears and criticism arrives. It is trusting your carefully examined principles even when they are unpopular. It is understanding that your character cannot be measured by the number of people who agree with you, but by the consistency with which you live according to your deepest convictions. The day your self-worth begins coming from your integrity instead of public recognition is the day those invisible chains begin to break. Approval may still feel good, but it no longer determines your direction. Rejection may still sting, but it no longer destroys your confidence. You become guided by purpose rather than praise, by wisdom rather than popularity, and by an inner compass that remains steady regardless of changing opinions. That is where genuine psychological freedom begins, and it is one of the greatest forms of power a human being can ever develop. Fear is one of the oldest survival mechanisms embedded within the human brain. It evolved to protect us from physical danger, helping our ancestors react quickly to threats in an unpredictable world. Yet in modern life, the greatest dangers are rarely wild animals or immediate physical harm. Instead, fear has become psychological. It appears as the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of criticism, the fear of uncertainty, or even the fear of standing apart from the crowd. These invisible fears are often more powerful than physical ones because they quietly shape everyday decisions without demanding our attention. Many people believe they are making independent choices when, in reality, they are simply avoiding discomfort. They choose careers that satisfy expectations instead of purpose, remain silent when they should speak, stay in unhealthy environments because change feels frightening, or abandon meaningful dreams because they fear being judged. In each of these moments, fear becomes an invisible architect, designing a life based not on potential, but on avoidance. Psychology explains this phenomenon through the brain's natural preference for certainty. The human mind dislikes ambiguity because uncertainty requires energy, patience, and courage. When confronted with unfamiliar situations, the brain often chooses the option that feels safest rather than the one that offers the greatest growth. This tendency creates a powerful cycle. Every time a person avoids a difficult conversation, delays an important decision, or retreats from a meaningful challenge because of fear, the brain learns that avoidance provides temporary relief. That relief becomes rewarding, reinforcing the behavior. Over time, what began as a single fearful decision transforms into a habit. Eventually, fear no longer needs to shout. It quietly influences nearly every choice, limiting opportunities before they are even explored. Throughout history, influential thinkers have observed that fear is one of the most effective forces shaping human behavior. It does not always require threats or coercion. Sometimes all it takes is the possibility of losing acceptance, status, comfort, or familiarity. A person who constantly fears disapproval becomes highly sensitive to the opinions of others. They begin measuring their worth through external approval instead of internal conviction. Their decisions gradually reflect what is expected rather than what is authentic. This is how fear can become a subtle form of control, not because someone is deliberately controlling them, but because their own anxiety has become the strongest voice guiding their actions. Modern neuroscience provides additional insight into why fear feels so convincing. When the brain perceives a threat, the amygdala rapidly activates emotional responses designed to protect us. While this response is invaluable during genuine emergencies, it can also be triggered by social situations that pose no physical danger. Public speaking, taking a financial risk, changing careers, expressing an unpopular opinion, or pursuing an ambitious goal can activate similar emotional alarms. The body reacts with increased heart rate, tension, and anxious thoughts, even though there is no immediate threat to survival. Without awareness, people mistake these physical sensations as evidence that they should retreat, when in reality they may simply be standing at the edge of meaningful growth. One of the greatest misconceptions about courage is the belief that fearless people experience no fear. In reality, courageous individuals often feel fear just as intensely as anyone else. The difference lies in their relationship with it. They recognize fear as information rather than instruction. Instead of asking, "How do I eliminate this feeling?" they ask, "What is this feeling trying to protect me from, and is that protection still necessary?" This simple shift transforms fear from a dictator into an advisor. It allows wisdom to evaluate emotional signals without surrendering authority to them. Personal growth begins the moment fear is observed rather than obeyed. Every meaningful achievement requires walking through uncertainty. Every confident person was once inexperienced. Every skilled leader was once hesitant. Every successful creator once faced doubt. Progress has never belonged to those who waited until fear disappeared. It has always belonged to those who acted despite it. Each courageous decision sends a powerful message to the brain. Uncertainty is survivable. Gradually, confidence replaces avoidance, not because fear vanishes, but because experience proves that growth exists on the other side of discomfort. Fear will always be a companion on the journey toward a meaningful life. It is part of being human. The objective is not to wage war against fear or pretend it does not exist. The objective is to prevent it from becoming the author of your future. When your principles become stronger than your anxieties, when your purpose becomes greater than your hesitation, and when your discipline consistently outweighs your excuses, fear loses its ability to define your destiny. It remains present, but it no longer sits in the driver's seat. Instead, it becomes a reminder that you are approaching something significant, something capable of expanding your character, strengthening your resilience, and revealing the fullest expression of your potential. Emotional reactions are among the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, yet they are also among the easiest pathways through which people can lose control over their own decisions. Throughout history, great thinkers have observed that individuals are rarely defeated by external circumstances alone. More often, they are defeated by their inability to govern their own emotional responses. Modern psychology supports this observation by showing that when emotions become overwhelming, the rational parts of the brain responsible for judgment, planning, and long-term thinking temporarily lose influence. In those moments, decisions are driven by impulse instead of wisdom. This is precisely why emotional self-regulation is not merely a personal virtue, it is a form of psychological freedom. Imagine a person who becomes angry every time they are criticized. The criticism itself is not controlling them, their automatic reaction is. Another individual immediately feels guilty whenever someone expresses disappointment, even when they have done nothing wrong. Again, the controlling force is not the other person's words, but the emotional trigger created within the mind. These patterns often develop over years through repeated experiences, social conditioning, or unresolved fears. Without conscious awareness, people become predictable. They react in the same way to the same situations, allowing external events to dictate their internal state. Behavioral psychology explains that predictable reactions are easier to influence because human behavior often follows familiar emotional patterns. Someone who constantly seeks approval may agree to requests they secretly dislike simply to avoid rejection. Another person who fears conflict may remain silent in situations where honesty is necessary. Someone driven by pride may overreact to small insults, sacrificing long-term goals for temporary emotional satisfaction. In each case, the individual believes they are making independent choices, yet their emotions have quietly become the invisible decision maker. This does not mean emotions are enemies. Emotions are essential signals that provide valuable information about our experiences, relationships, and environment. Fear can warn us of genuine danger. Sadness can encourage reflection and healing. Anger can reveal that an important value has been violated. The challenge begins when emotions move from informing our decisions to controlling them. Emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize these signals without becoming their servant. It is the discipline to acknowledge feelings while allowing wisdom, principles, and thoughtful judgment to determine the final response. One of the most powerful habits a person can develop is creating space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl famously observed that between what happens to us and how we respond lies a space, and within that space exists our freedom to choose. That pause may last only a few seconds, yet it changes everything. Instead of reacting instantly, a disciplined individual asks, "What is actually happening? Why am I feeling this way? Will my immediate reaction help or harm my long-term goals?" These simple questions interrupt automatic behavior and restore conscious choice. History consistently demonstrates that remarkable leaders, innovators, and philosophers possessed extraordinary emotional discipline. They faced criticism without immediate retaliation, setbacks without surrender, and success without arrogance. Their strength did not come from suppressing emotions, but from mastering them. They understood that calmness creates clarity, and clarity produces better decisions than emotional chaos ever could. In everyday life, this principle becomes equally valuable. A heated conversation can destroy years of trust if anger speaks before wisdom. A moment of insecurity can prevent someone from pursuing an opportunity that could transform their future. A burst of fear can convince a talented person to abandon their dreams before they truly begin. These outcomes are rarely caused by external obstacles alone. They are often created by unmanaged emotional reactions. True self-mastery, therefore, is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming emotionally aware, emotionally resilient, and emotionally intentional. The strongest individuals feel deeply, but they choose carefully. They refuse to let temporary emotions make permanent decisions. Their confidence comes not from controlling the world around them, but from governing the world within them. Once you achieve that level of emotional discipline, other people lose the ability to steer your behavior through guilt, fear, anger, or praise. You become guided by principles instead of impulses, by purpose instead of pressure, and by wisdom instead of reaction. That quiet mastery is one of the greatest forms of personal freedom any human being can ever attain.